Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. In today's video, I'm sharing 7 really scary stories from deep in the Appalachian Mountains. These creepy stories will make you think twice before going into these dark woods. But before we start, please hit that subscribe button and don't forget to like and share this video with your friends. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks, everyone. Now, let's get into these scary stories. I was 28 in 2016, running my own food truck business and honestly making decent money driving around to festivals and events across 3 states. The work was hard, sure, but I liked being my own boss and the freedom of it all. I'd been doing it for about 3 years by then, had my regular circuit of summer festivals, and was starting to build a real customer base. That June, I got booked for a weekend music festival up in the mountains of North Carolina. Lost Creek Campground, middle of nowhere but popular with the hipster crowd who paid premium prices for good food. 3 days of work for what I usually made in 2 weeks. I couldn't pass it up. The drive up there was beautiful, I'll give it that. Winding mountain roads, thick forests, the kind of place that makes you understand why people move to the mountains. Lost Creek Campground was tucked into a valley between 2 ridges with the creek running right through the middle of it. The festival grounds were bigger than I'd expected, maybe 200 campsites spread out between the trees, with a main stage area and vendor row set up in a big clearing. I got there Friday morning, set up my truck in the designated spot, and started serving lunch to the early arrivals. Business was great right from the start. Lots of hungry festival goers with cash to burn. It was around noon on Saturday when I first met Marcus. I was in the middle of the lunch rush, flipping burgers and taking orders, when this guy walks up, and I swear to God, it was like looking in a mirror. Same height as me, same build, even wearing similar clothes. Khaki shorts, blue t-shirt, baseball cap. I mean, people have doppelgangers, right? It happens. He ordered a burger and fries, paid with exact change, and introduced himself as Marcus. Said people were always telling him he had one of those familiar faces. We both laughed about the resemblance, and he seemed friendly enough. What struck me as odd, though, was how long he hung around after getting his food. Most customers grab their stuff and head back to their campsites or the music, but Marcus stayed by my truck asking questions about my business. How long had I been doing this? What festivals did I usually work? Where was I from originally? Normal small talk, I thought, just a guy interested in the food truck business. He was a good tipper, too, dropped a 20 in my tip jar for a $12 meal. But looking back now, I should have paid more attention to the way he was watching me work, like he was memorizing every movement I made. That night, the vendors all gathered around a campfire behind the main camping area. It's a tradition at these festivals. We work hard all day, then sit around swapping stories and sharing drinks. Marcus showed up about an hour after everyone else, carrying a 6-pack of the same beer I'd been drinking. He settled into the circle like he belonged there, and before long he was telling stories that sounded familiar. Stories about crazy customers, equipment breaking down at the worst possible moment, getting lost trying to find some remote festival venue. The thing is, these weren't just similar stories. They were my stories. The exact same details, the same punchlines, everything. But he was telling them like they'd happened to him. I figured maybe it was just one of those weird coincidences, you know? People in the same business have similar experiences. But then Marcus started using phrases I'd used earlier that day, my exact words and speech patterns, claiming them as his own. And I noticed he was wearing different clothes now. A flannel shirt and jeans that looked identical to what I'd worn the day before, right down to the same brand logos and faded spots. The other vendors started commenting on how similar we looked, joking about us being long-lost twins. But the weird thing was, Marcus looked more like me than I remembered looking, like he was a better version of me somehow. Sunday morning, I found Marcus standing by my food truck when I came to start prep work, just standing there at 6 in the morning, studying my equipment layout like he was trying to memorize it. He said he'd been up early and was just admiring my setup, but something about the way he was looking at everything made my skin crawl. Throughout the day, I kept catching him nearby, watching me work. He'd started copying my movements exactly. How I prepped food, how I served customers, even how I cleaned my workspace. And he wasn't just copying me, he was doing it better. smoother, more efficient. But the really unsettling part was when other vendors started telling me they'd already seen my food truck that morning on the opposite side of the festival grounds. I told them that was impossible. I'd been setting up right here since dawn. That's when I walked over and saw Marcus's truck. It was identical to mine. Same model, same year, same paint job, even the same dents and scratches I'd put in mine over the years. But his was cleaner somehow, like a showroom version of my truck. He was serving my menu, my recipes, using my exact same setup. And there was a line of customers waiting to buy from him. Customers started getting confused, coming up to my truck, saying they'd already bought food from me when I knew they hadn't. Some of them seemed annoyed, like I was trying to charge them twice for the same meal. Marcus wasn't just copying me anymore. He was becoming me and doing it better than I could myself. His food looked better than mine. His service was faster. His smile seemed more genuine. It was like watching a perfected version of myself steal my life. Sunday afternoon, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Marcus had somehow gotten copies of my business licenses and permits, all the official paperwork I needed to operate legally. But they had his name on them instead of mine. When I confronted him about it, he acted confused, said he'd been operating under those licenses for years. He started telling the other vendors that I was the copycat, that I was trying to steal his business by imitating him. And people were starting to believe him. The thing that really scared me was that Marcus knew things about me I'd never told anyone at the festival. Details about my childhood, my family, my business history. He was using these personal details to make his story more convincing, painting me as someone who'd been stalking him and copying his life. He told them about the time I'd gotten food poisoning from my own cooking and had to close for a day, something that had happened 6 months earlier, hundreds of miles away from here. How could he possibly know that? That night, I found my truck's tires slashed, all 4 of them cut deep enough that they couldn't be repaired. I was stranded. But when I went to report it to the festival security, they showed me footage from their cameras. The video clearly showed me slashing my own tires, except I'd been asleep in my tent when it happened. I watched myself on that grainy security footage, cutting my own tires with my own knife, wearing my own clothes. But it wasn't me. It was Marcus, wearing my face, using my voice, moving with my exact mannerisms. He'd started spreading stories about my mental health, using my voice and face to tell people I was having a breakdown. The festival organizers asked me to leave Monday morning, believing Marcus's claims that I was having some kind of psychotic episode. They were genuinely concerned for my safety and the safety of their other vendors. Marcus stood there while they talked to me, wearing an expression of sympathetic worry that looked exactly like my own face would look if I was worried about someone else. I watched him take over my vendor spot, serving my reci, pest to my customers, living my life better than I ever had. The worst part was, nobody seemed to miss me. They had Marcus now, and he was everything I was, just improved. More charming, more efficient, more likable. It was like I'd been replaced by a better version of myself, and everyone was happier for it. I confronted Marcus one last time before I left, and he responded in my exact voice, using my speech patterns to call me crazy. His face was now perfectly identical to mine, like looking in a mirror that showed the person I could have been if I'd tried harder. He told me I needed help, that this obsession with copying him was unhealthy. His concern sounded genuine because it was my voice, my mannerisms, my way of caring about people. That's when he showed me photos on his phone, pictures of other people he'd replaced, different faces, different lives, but the same story. He'd watch them, learn them, become them, and then take their place while they disappeared into obscurity. Some of the photos were old, dating back years. This wasn't his first time doing this. It was his life's work. Marcus offered me a deal then. He said I could become him in return, take his identity while he kept mine. Like a trade. He showed me his ID, his credit cards, his whole identity ready to hand over. For a moment, I actually considered it. What did I have left anyway? My business was ruined, my reputation destroyed. Maybe starting over as someone else would be easier, but something about the way he said it, the casual way he offered to trade lives like we were swapping baseball cards, made me realize this was never going to end. Even if I became Marcus, he'd still be out there, still becoming other people, still erasing lives and replacing them with better versions. And eventually, maybe he'd come back for Marcus's identity too, leaving me with nothing again. I destroyed my food truck before I left. Poured bleach in the oil, smashed the equipment, made it unusable. If I couldn't have my life, at least he wouldn't get to use my truck to live it. Of course, this just made me look crazier to everyone watching. Marcus stood there shaking his head sadly, telling people how sorry he felt for me, how he hoped I'd get the help I needed. He used this destruction as final proof of my mental illness, gaining even more sympathy and credibility. I abandoned everything else and drove home in my personal car, the only thing he hadn't yet learned to replicate. Changed my appearance as drastically as I could. Shaved my head, grew a beard, started wearing completely different clothes, moved to a different state, got a regular job working in a warehouse, started a completely new life under a different name. Had to rebuild from nothing. But at least it was my nothing. Sometimes I see news stories about my old identity. Marcus running his successful food truck business, expanding to multiple trucks, getting featured in food magazines. He's living my life better than I ever did, being me in ways I never could. The success I always dreamed of, he achieved using my face and my name. And looking back now, I'm not even sure I blame him for that part. The thing that keeps me awake at night is looking in mirrors. I never know anymore if the person staring back is really me, or if Marcus is still out there somewhere, still becoming me, perfecting the identity he stole. Maybe what I think is my reflection is just another copy he's made, and I'm the discarded version, living a borrowed life I don't even remember taking from someone else. I don't run food trucks anymore, don't go to festivals, don't even like crowds much these days, and I never, ever go back to the mountains of North Carolina. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if Marcus is still there at Lost Creek Campground, studying new victims, learning new lives to steal. And I wonder if he ever thinks about the life he took from me, or if I was just another face in his collection, forgotten as soon as he found someone better to become. I was 25 back in 2010, working for a house cleaning service out of Richmond, Virginia. Nothing glamorous about it. Mostly I'd drive out to these fancy vacation homes and clean up after rich people who couldn't be bothered to pick up their own mess. The pay was decent though, especially when you got the specialty jobs. That's what they called the really nasty ones. Houses that had been sitting empty for months, maybe years, where the cleaning was more like archaeology than housework. The Thornfield job came up in late September. My supervisor, Mrs. Chen, called it a premium assignment, which was her way of saying it was going to be absolutely disgusting, but they'd pay me triple overtime to deal with it. The owner had died 2 years earlier, and the family finally wanted to get the place ready for sale. Nobody had been inside since the funeral, she said. Just grab my supplies, take the keys, and work at my own pace. 3 days minimum, maybe more. I should have known something was off when she handed me the address. The Thornfield estate sat way out in the middle of nowhere, down in some valley I'd never heard of, about 2 hours south of Richmond. No neighbors for miles, she warned me. The kind of place where you better bring your own lunch because there's nowhere to buy food for 50 miles in any direction. The house itself was massive, one of those old colonial mansions that probably looked impressive back in 1890, but now just looked tired and forgotten. Thick forest pressed in from all sides, and the whole place had this heavy, still feeling to it, like the air was too thick to breathe properly. I parked in the circular driveway and just sat there for a minute, looking up at all those dark windows staring back at me. Inside was worse than Mrs. Chen had let on. Everything was covered in dust so thick it looked like gray snow had fallen in every room. Furniture hage, hidden under old sheets, cobwebs hanging like curtains in the corners. But it was the smell that really got to me. Not just musty and old, but something else underneath. Something dry and chalky, like old bones left in the sun. I started with the main floor, figuring I'd work my way up to the bedrooms over the next couple days. Basic stuff first. Sweeping, dusting, getting the worst of the grime cleared out so I could see what I was actually dealing with. That's when I found the first collection. The library was lined floor to ceiling with built-in shelves, but instead of books, every shelf held skulls. Animal skulls, all different sizes and shapes. Deer, raccoon, what looked like bear skulls, smaller ones I couldn't identify. At first I thought it was just some rich guy's hunting trophy collection, you know? But then I really looked at how they were arranged. Every single skull faced the exact same direction, like they were all watching something. And there were way too many of them, hundreds, maybe thousands. No hunter bags that many different animals unless they're doing something besides hunting. The whole room felt like a museum exhibit, everything positioned with surgical precision. That should have been my first clue to get back in the car and drive home. But the money was too good, and honestly, I'd cleaned weirder places. Rich people collect all kinds of strange stuff. I kept working through the main floor, and that's when I started finding the real collections. Not just skulls on shelves, but entire sculptures made from bones. In the dining room, there were columns built from what looked like human leg bones, stacked and fitted together so perfectly they actually supported the ceiling. Rib cages woven together to form arches over doorways. Even the chandelier was constructed from finger bones, hanging in delicate spirals. It wasn't random or crazy looking. This was architecture. Someone had used bones the way normal people use wood or steel, creating structural elements that were both beautiful and completely functional. The craftsmanship was incredible, and that's what made it so disturbing. I found the workshop in the basement. The whole lower level had been converted into some kind of bone preparation facility. Industrial sinks for cleaning, drying racks, specialized tools I didn't recognize. Power saws modified for cutting through bone, sanders for smoothing surfaces, even what looked like a kiln for hardening the finished pieces. Everything was still plugged in, still ready to use. The walls down there were covered in blueprints, not for houses or buildings, but for bone constructions. Detailed engineering diagrams showing load-bearing calculations for femur columns, stress distribution charts for ribcage foundations. Someone had spent decades figuring out how to build permanent structures using nothing but skeletal remains. While I was down there staring at those plans, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of a power saw running upstairs, coming from somewhere in the main house. I'd been alone since I arrived that morning, and I sure as hell hadn't left any tools running. I grabbed a flashlight and crept back upstairs, following the sound. It was coming from the library, but when I got there, everything was silent. Just those hundreds of skulls staring in their perfect formation. But there was bone dust in the air, fresh white powder still settling on the floor, and one of the deer skulls had new saw marks across the antlers. Someone, or something, was still working in that house. I should have left right then. Instead, I went back to the basement and found the tunnels. Hidden behind what looked like a solid wall, there were passages leading deeper underground. The walls were reinforced with human rib cages, and the ceiling was supported by columns made entirely from skulls. It was like walking through the skeleton of some enormous creature. The tunnel system was huge, branching out, in all directions under the property. Every surface was covered in bone constructions, getting more elaborate the deeper I went. And at the very end of the main passage, I found the cathedral. I don't know how else to describe it. Someone had built an entire church underground, using nothing but human and animal bones. The walls rose 30 feet high, made from thousands of carefully fitted skeletal remains. Flying buttresses constructed from interwoven rib cages. Stained glass windows where colored skulls had been arranged in intricate patterns. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I'd ever seen. That's when I met the architect. It stepped out from behind one of the bone pillars like it had been waiting for me. Tall and impossibly thin, covered in white dust from head to toe. Its clothes looked like they were made from stretched human skin, and its fingers were so long and narrow they looked more like bone tools than actual hands. When it moved, I could hear its joints creaking like old wood. The thing looked at me for a long moment, then pulled out a set of blueprints from inside its coat. It unrolled them on the cathedral floor, and I saw my own skeleton mapped out in precise detail. Measurements, stress calculations, notes about which of my bones would work best for specific architectural elements. It had been studying me since I arrived, planning exactly how to incorporate my remains into its construction project. I tried to back away, but the creature moved with me, staying just close enough to keep me cornered. It started arranging small bones on the ground, spelling out words: foundation, support, eternal. It was trying to communicate, to make me understand that this was an honor. My skeleton would become part of something magnificent, something that would last forever. The bone architect showed me around its masterpiece, pointing out the construction techniques with obvious pride. How rib cages could be woven together for maximum stability. How skulls formed perfect keystones for archways. How the natural curves of human bones created the most beautiful architectural lines when properly arranged. It pulled out a set of bone calipers and started taking measurements of my arms, my legs, my torso, planning cuts, calculating angles, figuring out exactly how each piece of me would fit into the overall design. The creature wasn't evil, I realized. It was just an artist, and human skeletons were its medium of choice. When it produced a dart made from a sharpened rib bone, I knew my time was up. The thing moved toward me with surgical precision, aiming for my neck. I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a skull from one of the wall decorations, and smashed it against the nearest bone column. The architect let out a sound I'll never forget. Not quite human, not quite animal, but pure anguish at watching its work destroyed. That gave me the opening I needed. I ran through the cathedral, knocking over bone sculptures, kicking in delicate archways, using my cleaning chemicals to dissolve whatever was holding the constructions together. The whole tunnel system started coming down as I destroyed the load-bearing elements, decades of careful work collapsing in minutes. The bone architect tried desperately to save its masterpiece, choosing its art over chasing me. I could hear it working frantically behind me, trying to shore up the collapsing structures as I found my way back to the surface. I called the county as soon as I got to my car, reported dangerous structural damage to the property. They condemned the whole estate within a week and brought in crews to demolish it. When they tore down the main house, they found evidence of the underground complex, but the official report just mentioned unstable foundation conditions and historical building materials of unknown origin. I never worked another old house after that. Stick to modern buildings now, places where I know exactly what went into the construction. Because sometimes, when I'm cleaning an older home and I find a room that feels just a little too cold or hear sounds that don't quite make sense, I remember those blueprints. And I wonder if maybe there are other architects out there, still building, still looking for the right bones to complete their masterpieces. To this day, I can't look at old houses the same way. Every creak, every shadow, every strange smell makes me think about what might be hiding in the walls, what someone might have been building in the dark spaces where nobody thinks to look. I still have dreams about that cathedral sometimes. Not nightmares exactly, but dreams where I can see how beautiful it really was, how perfect every joint was, how elegantly the bones curved to support impossible weights. And sometimes I wake up wondering what it would have felt like to be part of something that magnificent, something that would last forever. But then I remember those long, thin fingers measuring my bones, and I'm glad I never found out. I was 26 in 2018, working the overnight shift at WKMT, a tiny radio station in eastern Tennessee that mostly played country for truckers and insomniacs. The pay was terrible, but I needed every dollar I could get to keep up with my car payments after my transmission went out that spring. When our station manager mentioned a week-long remote broadcast gig up on Whisper Ridge for some music festival promotion, I jumped at it. Extra money, plus I'd always loved the idea of broadcasting from somewhere that felt bigger than our cramped studio downtown. Whisper Ridge sits about 40 miles southeast of Knoxville, one of those peaks that catches radio signals just right and bounces them out across half the state. Perfect for what we needed. I loaded my portable broadcast setup into my Honda Civic that Sunday evening. Nothing fancy, just the essential equipment in a couple of hard cases, along with enough energy drinks and gas station sandwiches to last me through the week. The drive up the winding mountain road took about an hour and a half, my headlights cutting through thick forest the whole way up. The broadcast site was a small clearing near the summit with a metal tower already in place for cell service. I set up my equipment on a picnic table someone had left there years ago, ran my cables to the tower, and did a signal test. Clear as a bell, better reception than we got at the main station. My first night went perfectly. Good listener response, truckers calling in with song requests, the usual mix of weather reports and classic rock that kept people company through those long, dark hours between midnight and dawn. It was Tuesday night when the emergency calls started coming in. Around 1:30 a.m., my phone rang with what sounded like a genuine distress call. A woman's voice, shaky and scared, saying she was lost somewhere on the mountain and could see my broadcast tower in the distance. She asked if I could help guide her to safety. I stayed on the line with her for maybe 10 minutes, trying to talk her through using her phone's GPS or finding any landmarks she could describe. But every time I'd give her directions or ask for more details, she'd go quiet for long stretches, then hang up without warning. I figured maybe she'd found help or her phone had died. Mountains are rough on cell service. But the next night, I got another call around the same time. Different voice, but the same basic story. Lost on the mountain, could see my tower, needed help getting out. This time it was a man, sounded older, claiming he'd been wandering around for hours. Same pattern though. I'd try to help, he'd get quiet, then hang up. By Thursday, I was getting 3 or 4 of these calls each night, always between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock a.m., always claiming to be lost in the same general area, always ending abruptly. But here's what started bothering me. I had a clear view for miles from up there, and my GPS never showed another soul within 20 miles of my location. The mountain was completely empty except for me. That's when my equipment started picking up conversations that weren't coming through the phone lines. I'd be sitting there during a song break, maybe checking weather reports or organizing my playlist, when I'd hear voices coming through my headphones. Not static or interference, actual conversations. People talking about everyday stuff, asking about the weather, commenting on songs I'd played earlier. Normal listener chatter, except they were talking to me, using my voice to respond. I'd hear myself having entire conversations I'd never actually had. My voice, my speech patterns, but saying things I'd never said to people I'd never talked to. It was like listening to someone doing a perfect impression of me, except it was too perfect. Every vocal quirk, every pause, every way I pronounced certain words. Nobody's that good at mimicking someone else. Friday morning, I got a call from my station manager asking why I'd been so rude to callers the night before. 3 different people had complained that I'd insulted them on the air, made fun of their music requests, even hung up on one guy mid-sentence. Problem was, I remembered every single call from Thursday night, and none of that had happened. I'd been polite to everyone, played their requests, never hung up on anybody. That's when I realized my microphone was recording everything, even when I wasn't broadcasting. I found the files on my laptop Saturday morning, hours and hours of audio from the entire week. Not just my on-air segments, but everything. Private phone calls to my girlfriend, me talking to myself while setting up equipment, even conversations I'd had with my neighbor before leaving for the mountain. Someone or something was harvesting every word I spoke, building a complete library of my voice. Saturday night, I decided to explore. I'd noticed a trail leading down from the ridge toward what looked like a cave system. Nothing on my maps, but the path was well worn, like people used it regularly. I grabbed my flashlight and followed it down about a quarter mile through thick woods until I reached an opening in the rock face. Not a natural cave, more like someone had carved out a space and reinforced it with concrete and steel beams. Inside, I found thousands of dollars worth of audio equipment. Professional recording gear, mixing boards, banks of digital storage drives, transmitters powerful enough to broadcast across multiple states. Everything was running, lights blinking, fans humming, like some kind of underground radio station. But it was the recordings that made my blood run cold. Shelves and shelves of labeled hard drives and tape reels going back decades. Names, dates, voices organized by year and location. I found files from radio DJs, emergency dispatchers, even telephone operators from the 1980s. Thousands of stuff. Len voices, all cataloged and stored like some kind of twisted library. My own name was on one of the newer drives. I plugged it in and found everything, not just from this week, but recordings of my voice going back years. Phone calls from college, conversations with my parents, even audio from my childhood somehow. Recordings that should have been impossible to obtain, voices from times and places where no equipment existed to capture them. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw something that still gives me nightmares. Tall, maybe 7 feet, but built all wrong. Too thin, like someone had stretched a normal person until they were barely holding together. Its skin was pale gray, almost translucent. And its mouth. God, its mouth was huge, unnaturally wide, opening way too far, with a throat that seemed to go on forever. The thing spoke to me in my own voice, not an imitation. My actual voice, like it was coming from my own throat. But the mouth moving was this creature's. It used my voice to tell me about its collection, how it had been gathering human sounds for over a century, learning to speak like us by stealing our ability to speak at all. It demonstrated by cycling through voices. Men, women, children, elderly people, all talking in their stolen voices about being lost on the mountain, about needing help, about seeing a radio tower in the distance. Every emergency call I'd received that week had been this thing using harvested voices to lure me into longer conversations, recording my responses to build a more complete voice profile. The creature's chest had chambers built into it, like some kind of organic sound system. I could hear dozens of voices echoing inside its body, all the people it had collected over the years. It told me, still using my voice, that it needed human communication to survive, that it was building a database, of our language, by taking our voices away piece by piece. That's when I felt my own voice getting weaker. Every word I spoke seemed to cost more effort, like the creature was siphoning off my ability to make sound. I could see my voice patterns appearing on the monitors around me as it absorbed them in real time. It was harvesting my voice while I watched, adding to its collection. I grabbed a baseball bat someone had left in the cave and started swinging at everything I could reach. Smashed hard drives, kicked over equipment racks, yanked cables out of the walls. The creature made this horrible sound, like every voice in its collection screaming at once, and lunged at me with those impossibly long arms. I ran, sprinted back up that trail faster than I'd ever moved in my life, the creature crashing through the woods behind me, still screaming with stolen voices. I could hear my own voice mixed in with all the others, begging me to come back, promising to return some sounds in exchange for others, offering trades like we were negotiating over baseball cards. I reached my broadcast equipment and did the only thing I could think of, cranked every volume knob to maximum and created the biggest feedback loop I could manage. The speakers shrieked with electronic noise that echoed off the mountainside and straight down into that cave system. The creature's screaming got louder, then suddenly stopped. Then every stolen voice it had collected came pouring out at once. The sound was indescribable. Decades of human voices, conversations, screams, laughter, all playing simultaneously at full volume. I could hear radio broadcasts from the 1940s mixed with cell phone calls from last week. Children's voices from 50 years ago overlapping with emergency dispatchers. All of it building into a wall of noise that you could hear for miles. I threw my equipment in the car and drove down that mountain as fast as my Honda could handle the curves. By the time I reached the main road, I could see emergency vehicles heading up, fire trucks, ambulances, even a helicopter. Later, I heard reports of strange broadcasts and unexplained sounds coming from Whisper Ridge that night. The radio station fired me for destroying expensive equipment, but they couldn't explain the cave full of audio gear that search and rescue found the next day. No sign of the creature, just thousands of damaged hard drives and enough broadcast equipment to run a small city's worth of radio stations. I lost my voice completely that night. Not gone entirely, but damaged in a way that never healed right. Sounds like I've got laryngitis all the time now, can barely whisper most days. I work as a sound engineer now, mixing audio for other people since I can't do radio anymore. It's good work, lets me stay behind the scenes where nobody expects me to talk much. Sometimes late at night when I'm working on a project, I'll hear my old voice coming through the monitors. My real voice, the way it used to sound before Whisper Ridge. It's mixed in with other people's audio, just a word here and there, like pieces of my voice are still out there somewhere, still being traded around in whatever's left of that collection. I never went back to check. I was 23 in 2007, working nights delivering pizzas for Mario's down in Charleston, trying to scrape together enough money for my community college textbooks. Honestly, it wasn't glamorous work, but the tips were decent enough if you didn't mind driving all over creation at weird hours. Most of my deliveries were pretty routine: apartment complexes, suburban houses, the occasional office building. I'd been doing it for about 8 months when I got the order that changed everything. It was a Saturday night in October around 9:30 when this delivery came through for Blood Ridge. Now, I'd heard of Blood Ridge before. It's this hunting area way up in the mountains, maybe 45 minutes outside the city if you know the back roads. The order was huge too, like $80 worth of pizzas, and the customer said there'd be a $20 tip waiting. My manager Pete checked the address twice, said it looked legit in the system, and honestly, I needed that money bad. My rent was due the following week, and I was already cutting it close. The GPS showed a road leading right up to the coordinates, so I loaded up my car with 6 large pizzas and headed out. The drive started normal enough, took the interstate for about 20 minutes, then got onto some smaller state roads that wound up into the mountains. As I got higher up, the roads got narrower and the trees got thicker. By the time I was 30 minutes in, I hadn't seen another car for probably 10 miles. The last part of the drive was this gravel road that switchbacked up the mountain for what felt like forever. My little Honda was struggling with the incline, and I kept having to slow down for the sharp curves. The whole time I'm thinking about that $20 tip and telling myself it's worth it. Looking back now, I should have turned around the second I lost cell service. But at 23, you think you're in Vino. Sybil, you know? I finally found the cabin exactly where the GPS said it would be, tucked back in this clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. It was a decent-sized place, looked well-maintained, with lights on in most of the windows. There were a couple of pickup trucks parked out front, so I figured it was just some hunters having a weekend party. I grabbed the pizzas from my back seat and walked up to the front door. I knocked pretty loud since I could hear voices and music inside, but nobody came to the door. I knocked again, waited a minute, then called out that I had their pizza delivery. That's when this voice from inside yelled back, telling me to just leave the food on the porch table and they'd slide the money out through the mail slot. It struck me as weird, but I'd had customers do stranger things, so I set the pizzas down on this wooden table by the door. Sure enough, a few seconds later, I heard the mail slot open and someone pushed out 4 20s and a 10. I counted it quick. Exactly what they owed, plus the tip they'd promised. I called out a thank you and headed back toward my car, thinking this was the easiest delivery I'd made all week. That's when I heard something moving in the woods around the cabin. Not like a deer or anything small. These were heavy footsteps, and they seemed to be coming from multiple directions. I stopped walking and listened closer. The footsteps stopped too, like whatever was out there was listening to me, listening to them. The hair on the back of my neck started standing up, and I picked up my pace toward the car. I got to my Honda and tried to start it up, but the engine just turned over without catching. It was making all the right sounds, like it wanted to start, but something was preventing it from actually running. I tried 3 or 4 times, pumping the gas pedal, but nothing. Meanwhile, I could still hear Mo. Vehement in the tree line, getting closer to the cabin. Then the lights inside the cabin went out, all at once. The voices and music stopped too, like someone had just flipped a master switch. I sat there in my car, engine still refusing to start, and realized I was completely alone in the dark on top of this mountain. That's when I heard the first howl. It came from somewhere up on the ridge above the cabin, and it was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't quite a wolf howl, but it wasn't human either. Something perfectly in between that made my blood go cold. The sound echoed off the mountains for what seemed like forever, and then the entire forest went completely silent. No insects, no birds, no wind in the trees. Just dead silence. I tried my phone, but there was no signal, which wasn't surprising up there. My car radio started picking up this weird static, these patterns that almost sounded like voices, but not quite. I kept trying to start the engine, getting more panicked each time it failed. That's when I decided to get out and check under the hood, thinking maybe something had come loose. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and popped the hood, and that's when I saw the footprints in the dirt around my car. They were huge, like a man's prints, but easily twice the size, and instead of toes, there were long claw marks. I counted at least 4 different sets of prints, all circling my car while I'd been up at the cabin door. More howls started answering from different directions, creating this coordinated chorus that surrounded the entire clearing. Whatever was out there was communicating, and they had me completely surrounded. My hands were shaking as I slammed the hood shut and got back in the car. My headlights started dimming and brightening randomly, and in the shifting light I could see shapes moving just at the edge of the beam. They were staying in the shadows, but I could tell they were big, and they were watching me. The smell hit me then, this mix of wet fur and something wild and predatory that got stronger as they got closer. I looked, got over at the porch, and saw that the pizza boxes had been torn open and scattered around, but the food wasn't eaten. It was like they'd been examining it, trying to figure out what human food was. That scared me more than anything else because it meant they were intelligent enough to be curious about us. Then I saw the first one clearly. It stepped into my headlight beam about 20 feet from my car, and I swear I've never seen anything like it. It had to be 8 feet tall, covered in this dark matted fur, but it was standing upright like a person. The worst part was its face. It had almost human features, but with this wolf-like muzzle full of teeth that were way too big and sharp. Its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, but there was intelligence there, like it was studying me. The creature walked up to my car with this casual confidence, like it owned the place. It started testing my door handles, examining the windows, trying to understand how the car worked. It wasn't aggressive exactly, more like it was learning. That's when I realized there were more of them, moving out of the tree line with this coordinated precision that reminded me of a pack of wolves, but smarter. They began circling my car in this tightening spiral, taking turns getting close while the others watched. The pack leader, the first one I'd seen, started making these sounds that were almost like attempts at human speech, garbled words that might have been trying to copy something I'd said. It was like they were trying to figure out what I was before they decided what to do with me. One of them picked up my pizza delivery bag from where I'd dropped it and examined it carefully, turning it over in its hands like it was trying to understand why I'd brought food to their territory. They were working together too, with some of them distracting me while others moved around to the back of my car, probably trying to disable it further. The coordination was the most terrifying part. This wasn't random animal behavior. It was intelligent pack hunting that had been refined. Over who knows how many generations. They'd probably been taking people up on Blood Ridge for years. The pack leader approached my driver's side window and pressed its face against the glass. Those intelligent eyes stared right at me, studying my face, my reactions, like it was trying to understand human fear. Then it started mimicking sounds I'd made earlier, my voice calling hello at the cabin door, even the sound of my car engine trying to start. But the mimicry was wrong somehow, missing some crucial human element that made it sound alien and threatening. The other pack members positioned themselves at each corner of my car, clearly preparing for a coordinated attack. One of them started rocking the car rhythmically while another used its claws to try and break the rear window with calculated, intelligent strikes. They weren't just trying to get in, they were testing my defenses systematically. The pack leader let out this howling pattern that drove the others into a frenzy. That was their signal, and they attacked all at once. Claws scraped against metal, multiple creatures trying to break in from different points simultaneously. The sound was horrible, like nails on a chalkboard, but 100 times worse. I thought for sure they were going to get through the glass. In desperation, I started honking my horn continuously. The loud, sudden noise seemed to confuse them, breaking their coordination for just a second. I used that moment to try the engine one more time, and this time it caught, like whatever had been blocking it was distracted by the horn. I didn't hesitate. I floored the accelerator and smashed right through two of the creatures that were blocking the road. I felt their bodies impact the car, heard them roar in pain and anger, but I kept driving. The entire pack chased me down that mountain road, and I swear they kept pace with my car for over a mile, all before finally giving up. I made it to the main road with my car completely destroyed. Every surface was covered in deep scratches. My rear window was gone, and there were dents everywhere from where they'd hit the metal. I drove straight to the police station, but when I tried to explain what had happened, they just said wolf attacks weren't uncommon in the mountains, and there wasn't much they could do about it. The pizza shop fired me the next day. They said I'd made up the whole story to avoid responsibility for losing the delivery bag and destroying my car. My manager, Pete, acted like he'd never heard of Blood Ridge, even though he'd checked the address himself. 3 weeks later, another delivery driver went missing up in that area. They found his car torn apart just like mine had been, but they never found him. The police wrote it off as a bear attack. I started having nightmares about those coordinated howls, waking up in cold sweats, hearing their hunting calls in my head. I moved to a city apartment where I could hear traffic and people at all hours. I never wanted to be alone in the quiet again. Even now, 15 years later, I still can't eat pizza without remembering the sound of them tearing open those boxes, trying to understand what human food was. I changed my major to accounting and got an office job as soon as I could. Never wanted to work anywhere that required driving alone at night again. Sometimes, even here in the city, I think I hear howling in the distance, and I know they're still up there on Blood Ridge, still hunting, still learning about us. I still check my rearview mirror obsessively when I drive, convinced I'll see those glowing eyes keeping pace with my car. And honestly, I probably always will. I'm 35 now, and I work for UPS in Louisville, but back in 2013 I was carrying mail for the Postal Service in eastern Kentucky. I was 24 then, fresh out of training, and honestly just happy to have a steady job with benefits. The mountains weren't my first choice for living, but the pay was decent, and I figured I could handle driving around rural routes all day. How hard could it be, right? When they assigned me to the Copper Creek Hollow route, my supervisor Jim mentioned it was challenging territory, but didn't really explain what that meant. The previous carrier, an older guy named Earl, had worked that route for 15 years before retiring suddenly. I asked Jim if I could talk to Earl about the route, maybe get some tips, but Jim just shrugged and said Earl wasn't interested in talking shop anymore, said he'd moved down to Florida to be near his daughter. The route itself covered about 30 houses scattered through these deep mountain valleys, connected by winding dirt roads that my GPS couldn't even find half the time. Most of the families were normal mountain folks, friendly enough, kept to themselves, appreciated getting their mail delivered way out there. But there were a few houses that just felt wrong from the start. I can't really explain it better than that. You know how some places just make your skin crawl for no reason you can put your finger on? That's what I'm talking about. The worst one was the Brennan place, way at the end of this long dirt road that cut through thick forest for maybe 2 miles. The house itself was old but well maintained, painted white with a big wraparound porch. It looked like a working farm. There were barns and outbuildings, neat fenced fields, but I never saw any animals. No cows, no horses, not even chickens. For a farm, it was way too quiet. Mrs. Brennan was probably in her 80s, thin as a rail, but surprisingly strong-looking. She was always waiting for me on the porch when I pulled up, like she'd been watching the road. Most of my customers barely acknowledged me, but Mrs. Brennan was different. She'd ask about my health, my family, whether I was eating enough. She seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being, which I thought was sweet at first. She'd offer me lemonade and homemade cookies, insist I sit down and rest for a few minutes. The lemonade was always ice cold and perfect, and honestly, those cookies were some of the best I'd ever had. Mrs. Brennan claimed she used to be a nurse, said she could tell just by looking at someone whether they were healthy or not. She kept saying I looked anemic, that I needed to take better care of myself. After about a month on the route, I started noticing some weird things. For one, I'd ask other postal workers about Copper Creek Hollow, and they'd get this look on their faces. Nobody wanted to talk about it. When I pressed Jim about why the route had such high turnover, apparently several carriers before Earl had quit or transferred after just a few months, He just said some people weren't cut out for rural delivery. Mrs. Brennan's questions started getting more specific too. She wanted to know my blood type, whether I had any family history of heart problems or diabetes, whether I took any medications. She claimed it was just friendly concern, that her nursing background made her worry about young people not taking care of themselves. But something about the way she asked felt off. Then she started checking my vital signs. I'd pull up to deliver her mail, and she'd insist on taking my pulse, examining my fingernails for signs of illness, checking my eyes. She had all kinds of medical equipment on her porch: blood pressure cuff, thermometer, even what looked like supplies for drawing blood. When I asked about it, she said she sometimes helped neighbors with basic medical care since the nearest hospital was over an hour away. The weird part was, other residents on my route started asking about my health too. The Millers, who lived about 5 miles from the Brennans, wanted to know if I was feeling tired lately. The Clarks asked if I'd been losing weight. It was like they'd all been talking to each other about me, which seemed strange for families that lived so far apart. Mrs. Brennan began offering me what she called vitamin supplements, little white pills that she said would boost my energy and help with the anemia she was convinced I had. I didn't think I was anemic, but I was feeling pretty worn out most days. The mountain air and all that driving were taking it out of me, I figured. So I started taking her vitamins. That's when things got really weird. Instead of feeling more energetic, I felt constantly tired. I'd finish my route and have to pull over for a nap in my mail truck. Some days I was so drowsy I could barely keep my eyes open. I'd wake up with these small bandages on my arms that I didn't remember putting there, like I'd had blood drawn or something. Mrs. Brennan started tracking my weight and energy levels like it was her job. She had a little notebook where she'd write down notes after every visit. When I asked what she was writing, she'd just smile and say she was keeping track of my health progress. But I wasn't making any progress. I was getting weaker. One day in October, I was feeling particularly awful and decided to stop taking the vitamins. Mrs. Brennan noticed immediately. She seemed almost panicked, insisting that stopping the supplements would be dangerous for my health. She increased the dosage and started adding liquid vitamins to the lemonade. I pretended to drink it, but I was getting suspicious. I started doing some digging. Turns out every mail carrier who'd worked the Copper Creek route for the past 20 years had reported similar health problems. Fatigue, weakness, memory problems. Most had quit within 6 months. A few had been hospitalized for severe anemia, but doctors could never figure out the cause. The breakthrough came when I was delivering mail to the post office in town and overheard a conversation between 2 EMTs. They were talking about how many calls they'd gotten to remote mountain properties for medical emergencies involving delivery drivers, utility workers, and mail carriers. Always the same thing: severe blood loss from unknown causes. That's when I decided to take a closer look at the Brennan property. I parked my truck at the end of their road one evening after work and walked up through the woods. The house was dark, but I could see lights in the barn. I crept closer and looked through a window that had been left cracked open. What I saw in there made my blood run cold. It was set up like a medical facility: hospital beds, IV equipment, refrigerated storage units, and there were charts on the wall tracking blood production from different donors. I recognized some of the names: previous mail carriers, the UPS driver, the guy who read the electric meters. But the worst part was seeing Mrs. Brennan moving around in there. She wasn't moving like an old woman anymore. She was quick, precise, almost mechanical in her movements. And when she turned toward the window, I saw her face clearly for the first time in good light. Her skin was pale as paper, almost translucent. Her eyes were completely black, no whites at all. And when she smiled, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth. She wasn't human. I don't know what she was, but she definitely wasn't human. I managed to get back to my truck without being seen, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely start the engine. Everything made sense now. The questions about my health, the medical equipment, the vitamin supplements that made me weak instead of strong. She'd been preparing me, like a farmer fattening up livestock. Next morning, I called in sick and drove straight to the state police barracks in Hazard. The trooper I talked to seemed skeptical until I mentioned the Brennan property specifically. Turns out they'd had their eye on that area for years due to suspicious missing person reports and medical emergencies, but they'd never been able to get a warrant. My testimony, combined with the medical records from the Postal Service showing a pattern of health problems among Copper Creek route carriers, was enough to get them a search warrant. What they found in that barn was worse than I'd imagined. 3 people were being kept there as prisoners. The previous mail carrier before Earl, a utility worker who'd gone missing 2 years earlier, and a truck driver who'd been reported missing 6 months back. They were all severely anemic and delusional, but alive, barely. Mrs. Brennan was gone when the police arrived. So were most of the other families I'd been delivering mail to on that route. The whole thing had been a setup, an operation to harvest blood from workers who had legitimate reasons to visit remote mountain properties. They never found Mrs. Brennan or the others. The rescued victims couldn't provide much useful information. Their memories were fragmented, and they kept talking about the pale ones who needed fresh blood to survive. The doctors said they'd been systematically bled for months, kept alive with IV fluids and medical care. The Postal Service immediately discontinued the Copper Creek Hollow route and transferred me to Louisville. I still work for UPS now, strictly urban deliveries. I never go back to the mountains if I can help it. Sometimes I still feel weak and dizzy, especially when I get blood drawn for routine medical checks. The doctors say my iron levels are normal now, but I wonder if whatever they did to me left some kind of permanent damage. I wonder, too, if there are other operations like that still running in remote areas where people won't ask too many questions about missing workers. I don't talk about this much. Most people, too. I think I'm crazy when I try to explain it. But I know what I saw, and I know how close I came to ending up like those other guys, kept alive just long enough to serve as a blood bank for something that wasn't quite human. I still have nightmares about Mrs. Brennan's smile and those needle teeth. Sometimes I wake up checking my arms for new puncture marks, even though I know I'm safe now. But you never really feel safe after something like that. You never stop looking over your shoulder, wondering if they're still out there, setting up shop somewhere new, waiting for the next unsuspecting mail carrier to come driving down their dirt road. Back when I was 29, I worked as an insurance adjuster for a mid-sized company out of Nashville. Not the most exciting job, but it paid decent and kept me busy driving around Tennessee investigating claims. I'd been doing it for about 6 years by 2014, and honestly, I thought I'd seen everything. House fires, storm damage, break-ins, you name it. Most of the time it was pretty straightforward. Take some photos, interview the homeowners, write up a report. The worst part was usually just the drive, especially when they sent me out to the really rural areas where cell service got spotty and GPS would lose you halfway up some mountain road. That October, I got assigned to what seemed like a routine case in Devil's Creek, way up in the mountains near the Kentucky border. Total loss house fire. Family claiming something supernatural was responsible. I figured it was either insurance fraud or just traumatized people trying to make sense of losing everything. The drive to Devil's Creek took me almost 3 hours on winding mountain roads that got narrower the higher I climbed. I passed maybe 5 other houses the entire way, most of them looking like they'd been abandoned for years. The whole area felt forgotten, like time had just stopped moving up there. My GPS started acting up about an hour into the mountains, constantly recalculating and telling me to turn around. Eventually, I just had to follow the road signs and hope for the best. When I finally found the property, I could see why the Pattersons had filed a total loss claim. The house was completely destroyed, just a blackened foundation and some twisted metal that used to be appliances. The smell of smoke still hung in the air even though the fire had been out for 2 weeks. What struck me as odd was how isolated the place was. The nearest neighbor had to be at least a mile away, and the house sat alone in this lit, valley surrounded by thick forest. Perfect place for insurance fraud, if I'm being honest. Remote location, no witnesses, family claims supernatural cause, so they're not technically lying about arson. I met with the Patterson family at their neighbor's house since they obviously couldn't stay on their own property. Tom and Sarah Patterson, both in their 50s, and their teenage daughter Emma. They seemed genuinely traumatized, not like the usual fraudsters I dealt with who were either too eager to talk or obviously rehearsed. Sarah kept wrapping and unwrapping a tissue in her hands while Tom stared out the window toward their burned property. Emma wouldn't even look at me. When I asked them to tell me what happened, Tom took a deep breath and said they'd been dealing with something stalking their property for about 3 weeks before the fire. He called it a hollow man, something that looked human from a distance but was empty inside, like someone had cut a person-shaped hole out of the world itself. Sarah nodded along, adding details about how it would stand at the edge of their yard at night, always exactly 50 feet away, just watching. Emma finally spoke up to say it had been copying their routines, learning when they left for work and school, mimicking the way they moved around their house. I'll be honest, it sounded like textbook rural paranoia mixed with grief over losing their home. I'd heard similar stories before. Isolated families start seeing things, especially after traumatic events, but something about the way they described this thing bothered me. They weren't describing a monster or some local legend. This sounded more like surveillance, like something studying them. Still, I had a job to do, so I thanked them for their time and headed over to the property to start documenting the damage. That's when things got weird. I started photographing the fire damage around what used to be the front of the house and immediately noticed my camera was acting up. The digital display would flicker and show error messages, but only when I pointed it towards certain areas of the foundation. I tried different angles and settings, but some spots just wouldn't photograph properly. At first I figured it was interference from the metal debris, maybe some electrical issue from the fire. But when I tested my equipment on the undamaged areas of the property, everything worked fine. Then I started taking measurements for my report, and that's when I knew something was seriously wrong. My tape measure kept giving me different readings for the same distances. I'd measure from the foundation to the tree line and get 32 feet. Then I'd do it again and get 28 feet. Third time, 35 feet. I thought maybe I was making mistakes, so I slowed down and was extra careful, but the measurements kept changing. The footprints in the ash were what really got to me. Perfect human prints, size 11 boots by the look of them, but they led in directions that made no sense. I'd follow a trail from the driveway toward the house, normal walking pattern. Then the prints would continue straight through where the living room wall used to be. Not around the debris or through a doorway. Straight through solid space like the wall wasn't there when those steps were made. I spent the next hour trying to map out the original floor plan of the house using the foundation and the debris patterns, but I couldn't get consistent measurements. According to my notes, the house was simultaneously 1,200 square feet and 1,800 square feet, depending on which measurements I used. My GPS couldn't get a solid fix on the property coordinates either. It kept showing the house in 3 different locations within about a 100-yard radius. Around noon, I decided to take a break and eat lunch by my car. I was getting frustrated and figured maybe I was just making rookie mistakes because of the remote location and the strange story the fille said about Emily had told me. But as I sat there looking over my notes, I realized I'd been feeling dizzy and disoriented for the past hour, especially when I stood in certain spots around the foundation. It felt like vertigo, like the ground wasn't quite level even though it obviously was. That's when I saw it. I was reviewing the photos on my camera when I noticed movement at the back of the property. Just a shadow at first, near the tree line. But as I watched, it moved into the clearing and I could see it was shaped like a person. A tall, thin person walking with an odd gait, not quite touching the ground with each step. From maybe 100 feet away, it looked completely normal. But as it got closer, I started to see what the Pattersons had tried to describe. It was like looking at a hole in the world, shaped like a man. I could see the trees and the sky right through where its body should be, but my brain kept trying to process it as a person walking toward me. The closer it got, the more my eyes started to water and my head started to pound. It felt like trying to focus on something that fundamentally shouldn't exist. The hollow man stopped exactly 50 feet away from me, just like the family had said. It stood there perfectly still, and I got the distinct impression it was studying me. Not threatening, just curious, like it was trying to figure out what I was doing there and how I fit into whatever pattern it had been learning. I managed to lift my camera and take a few shots, though my hands were shaking. When I looked at the display, the photos showed a dark, person-shaped void against the background of the forest. But when I scrolled through them, each image was slightly different. In one, the void was facing left. In another, it was turned toward me. In the third, it was gone entirely. I looked up from the camera, and the hollow man was still there, but now it was mimicking my posture, standing the same way I was standing, holding something up to its face like it was taking pictures of me. The mimicry was perfect except for the fact that I could see straight through it to the trees behind. That's when I realized what had really happened to the Patterson house. This thing had been watching them, learning their routines, studying how they lived. But its presence had been warping reality around the property. The inconsistent measurements, the equipment failures, the footprints that went through walls. It wasn't that the hollow man had burned down their house. The house had caught fire because reality itself was breaking down under the strain of this thing existing in our world. I packed up my equipment as quickly as I could, keeping one eye on the hollow man. It followed me back to my car, maintaining that exact 50-foot distance, but its movements were becoming more erratic. It was copying the way I loaded my gear, the way I opened the car door, even the way I fumbled with my keys. But something was wrong with its mimicry now. The movements were too sharp, too quick, like it was losing the ability to copy human behavior accurately. As I drove away, I could see it in my rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road. But the farther I got from the property, the less solid it looked. By the time I reached the main highway, I couldn't see it at all. I drove straight back to Nashville and turned in a report citing equipment failure and recommending the company send a different adjuster. I claimed my camera had malfunctioned and I hadn't been able to get proper documentation. It was a lie, but it was better than submitting a report full of impossible measurements and photos of something that shouldn't exist. The Patterson family's claim was eventually approved by another adjuster who found clear evidence of an electrical fire. Normal cause, normal investigation, normal payout. Sometimes I wonder if that's the reality the hollow man created, or if there are multiple versions of that investigation still happening. Somewhere in Devil's Creek. All I know is that I requested a transfer to commercial claims after that, and I've never taken another rural residential case. To this day, I can't look at my old camera equipment without thinking about those photos that kept changing every time I looked at them. And sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas for work, I catch myself checking my rearview mirror a little too often, making sure nothing is following me at exactly 50 feet behind. I was 25 in 2005, working for the electric company doing power line maintenance in remote areas of North Carolina. It wasn't glamorous work, but I liked being outdoors, and the pay was decent enough for a guy fresh out of trade school. Most of my jobs were routine stuff, replacing transformers, clearing tree branches, fixing lines after storms. But that March, I got assigned to repair storm damage in a place called Hemlock Gorge, way up in the mountains where fallen trees had knocked down transmission lines. The job required hiking into deep forest with all my equipment, working alone to restore power to a handful of mountain communities that had been without electricity for over a week. Honestly, I was excited about it. Hemlock Gorge was pristine wilderness, the kind of place that made utility work feel like a privilege instead of just another job. I packed my climbing gear, electrical tools, and camping equipment for what should have been a 3-day repair job. The storm damage looked extensive but manageable from the aerial photos, several miles of lines down through old-growth forest. My supervisor warned me it might take longer than expected, but he seemed confident I could handle it solo. I set up my base camp near a creek that ran through the bottom of the gorge and began working systematically through the damaged sections. The forest was incredibly old, with massive hemlock trees that had been growing for centuries. Some of them were easily 8 feet in diameter, towering up so high I couldn't see their tops. The air smelled clean and earthy, and except for the downed power lines, everything felt untouched by human activity. The first 2 days went smoothly. I made good progress clearing debris and restringing wire, working my way deeper into the gorge section by section. The weather held up, and my equipment was functioning perfectly. I remember thinking, this might be the best assignment I'd ever gotten. Peaceful, challenging, and paying overtime. Everything changed on the 3rd day when I started working deeper in the gorge and found trees that had grown in impossible ways. The first weird thing I noticed was that some of the power lines hadn't actually been damaged by the storm at all. Instead, they'd been deliberately woven through tree branches, as if someone had carefully threaded them into the canopy. The trees had grown around electrical equipment, incorporating transformers and utility poles into their structure like they were part of the living wood. I stood there staring at a telephone pole that was completely embedded in the trunk of a massive hemlock, the wood having grown around it so completely you could barely see the original post. I thought maybe I was looking at decades of gradual growth that no one had bothered to maintain, but when I started following the lines, I found root systems that had grown underground in perfect parallel formations, following the power cables for hundreds of yards. Some trees had metallic bark that actually conducted electricity, creating natural extensions of the power grid. My testing equipment showed current flowing through living wood, which should have been impossible. The forest was using human infrastructure, turning utility lines into part of its own nervous system. I found evidence that this integration had been happening for years, long before the recent storm. Trees were generating their own electricity somehow, feeding power back into the grid. When I checked my voltage meters, they showed readings that made no sense, more power coming out of certain sections than was going in. That's when I started feeling disoriented. Working near the integrated trees made my head fuzzy, like they were affecting my nervous system the same way they'd taken over the electrical systems. My hands would shake when I touched certain lines, not from electric shock, but from something else, something that felt almost alive. I realized the forest itself had become a hybrid organism, part plant and part electrical network. On my fourth day, I saw it. I was working on a section where 3 massive hemlocks had grown together, their trunks fused into a single enormous base. Power lines ran through all 3 trees, and I could hear a low humming sound coming from inside the wood. As I got closer to investigate, the base of the center tree began to split open, and something emerged. It looked like a person made of roots and copper wire. Its body was part plant and part electrical component, with actual power lines growing through its limbs like veins. The thing was tall, maybe 7 feet, with a vaguely human shape, but completely wrong proportions. Its arms were too long, ending in fingers that looked like tree roots wrapped in electrical cable. Where its face should have been was just a tangle of copper wire and smaller roots, constantly shifting and reconnecting. The root walker, that's what I started calling it in my head, moved by extending root systems underground, then sprouting new bodies from different trees. I watched it disappear into the ground near one hemlock and emerge from another tree 50 yards away, like it was teleporting through the forest's root network. It was maintaining the electrical integration, repairing connections, and extending the network with its own body. It began following me as I worked, staying just at the edge of my vision. I could feel it watching me, studying my repair techniques and the way I used my tools. When I'd finish a section and move on, I'd look back to see it touching the lines I'd just fixed, running its root fingers along the cables like it was learning from my work. Then it started helping. I'd be struggling to string a new line between 2 trees, and suddenly roots would emerge from the trunks to hold the cable in place. The creature was learning to be a utility worker, copying my methods but using organic equivalents instead of tools. It could grow new connections faster than I could install them manually, creating living bridges between trees that carried electricity through wood and root systems. The more I explored, the more I realized this thing had been maintaining power to the mountain communities for years without any human intervention. The root walker was keeping the lights on in remote areas by becoming part of the electrical infrastructure itself. Houses that should have been cut off from the grid were somehow still getting power through underground root networks that connected to the main lines miles away. But it wanted more than just to maintain the existing system. It wanted to integrate me. The root walker began extending tendrils toward me while I worked, trying to make physical contact. Its touch carried electrical current, not enough to hurt, but enough to feel like it was testing my compatibility with the forest network. I started experiencing small shocks that felt intentional, like the forest was probing my nervous system to see how well I'd interface with its hybrid electrical-biological structure. That's when it showed me the others. Deep in the gorge, where the trees were oldest and most densely integrated with power lines, I found them. Other utility workers who had been absorbed into the forest network. Their bodies were still recognizable but transformed, growing out of tree trunks like permanent fixtures. They were still conscious, still alive in some way, but they'd become part of the organism that maintained the power grid from inside. Their eyes tracked me as I approached, and I could see intelligence there, but they couldn't speak. Instead, they communicated through electrical fluctuations in the nearby power lines, causing lights on my testing equipment to blink in patterns. I realized they were trying to warn me, telling me to run before the forest claimed me too. The root walker emerged from a tree right next to me, its copper wire face inches from mine. I could smell ozone and damp earth, and feel electrical current in the air around it. Through some kind of neural connection, maybe through the shared electrical field, it showed me what it was offering. I could become part of something larger, give my work permanent meaning. Instead of just maintaining power lines until I retired or died, I could be part of an eternal system that would keep growing, keep connecting, keep bringing power to places that needed it. For a moment, I almost said yes. The vision it shared was beautiful in its own way. A living electrical network that could adapt and heal itself, that could bring power to the most remote areas without destroying the environment. I could feel the consciousness of the other workers in the network, and they seemed content, maybe even happy to be part of something so much bigger than themselves. But then I remembered that I had a choice, and they probably hadn't. The forest was expanding its reach, using utility infrastructure to spread into human settlements. Every power line was a potential pathway, every electrical device a possible endpoint for its influence. The root walker wasn't evil exactly, just following its nature to grow and integrate everything it touched. But that didn't mean I had to let it take me. When it reached out to grab me with those copper-wrapped root tendrils, I fought back the only way I knew how. I overloaded sections of the power grid, creating electrical fires that damaged the forest network. I used my knowledge of electrical systems to create feedback loops that disrupted the hybrid nervous system, sending surges of power through the organic components until smoke started rising from several trees. The creature retaliated by cutting power to entire communities, holding them hostage for my cooperation. I could see lights going out across the valley as it systematically disconnected houses from the grid. I had to see who's between my own escape and the power needs of thousands of mountain residents who depended on electricity for heat, medical equipment, and basic safety. I made the hardest decision of my career. I sabotaged the main transmission lines leading out of the gorge, isolating the forest network from the broader power grid. It meant those communities would stay without power longer, but it also meant the root walker couldn't spread its influence beyond the gorge. The creature screamed through every electrical device in the area as its connection to civilization was severed. Power tools, my radio, even my flashlight shrieked with electronic feedback. Trees throughout the forest began shaking, their integrated electrical systems overloading and sparking. I ran through the chaos, grabbing only my essential gear and leaving everything else behind. I escaped while the forest was distracted trying to repair its severed electrical connections. It took me 6 hours of hiking through unfamiliar terrain to reach my truck, and by then I was exhausted, dehydrated, and probably in mild shock from everything I'd witnessed. The power company classified Hemlock Gorge as too dangerous for human maintenance after my report. They rerouted power around the area and left it to go dark. Officially, the reason was unstable terrain and repeated equipment failures. But my supervisor knew there was more to it. He never asked for details, just marked the area as permanently off limits for solo work. I stayed with the company for 3 more years, but I never took another remote assignment. I stuck to suburban work after that, replacing streetlights, maintaining transformers in residential neighborhoods, jobs where I was never more than a mile from other people. I told myself it was just a preference, but honestly, I was scared of what else might be out there in the places where civilization meet, as wilderness. Sometimes the lights flicker in mountain communities near Hemlock Gorge, and I wonder if the root walker is still trying to reconnect to our world. I've thought about going back, maybe trying to establish some kind of communication or understanding with it, but I never have. Part of me is afraid of what I might find, and part of me is afraid of what it might convince me to become. I'm 44 now, working as an electrical inspector for the county. Safe, predictable work with regular hours and no camping required. But I still think about those workers I left behind in the forest, and I wonder if they're still conscious, still maintaining their part of that impossible electrical ecosystem. I tell myself they chose their fate, but deep down I know that's probably not true. The forest is still out there, still growing, still learning. And sometimes, when I'm working late and the power grid fluctuates just right, I swear I can feel it reaching for me through the lines.